All right, so I think I'll start us off. More people will join. But let me introduce myself. My name is Stephen Ruszczyk. I am Assistant Professor of Sociology at Montclair State University. It's my distinct honor to engage in conversation tonight with Reverend M William Howard Jr. We'll talk about protests, social movements, multiracial democracy, and decolonization. We'll also explore what we can do about them and what government should do about them, ultimately. After growing up in Georgia during the Jim Crow era, Reverend Howard attended Morehouse College and Princeton for his Master of Divinity degree. He has since received several honorary degrees and numerous awards for his work on racial justice, civil rights, and human rights. In particular, Reverend Howard was closely involved in the international efforts to divest and end apartheid in South Africa. He has also served as president of the New York Theological Seminary. Over the past 5 decades, he has held several leadership positions in national and international organizations, including the American Committee on Africa, the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches, the National Urban League, the Council on Foreign Relations, and many more. He was pastor of the Bethany Baptist Church in Newark from 2000 to 2015. And this year, he is the author of a new book, called Black Not Dutch, The Reformed Church in America's Response to the Black Manifesto, and is published by Africa World Press. So we have the privilege to host tonight's conversation with Reverend M. William Howard. Thank you so much for spending an evening with us and letting us learn from your experiences and your ideas. In terms of the format for tonight's session, we'll hear from Reverend Howard for the first 45 minutes or so, and then I'll take questions from the audience. So when you have questions during the talk, please note them down and add them to the chat box at that time. And just before we jump into it, I would be remiss to not mention voter registration. Montclair State has a nonpartisan voter registration website where you can register to vote and find out more about where and how to vote. And the deadline for voter registration is October 13th. So you still have a week and a day to get that in. All right, so I thought it would be helpful for students to begin with your early life to get a sense of, where your trajectory starts. Can you share a little something about where and how you grew up and how you became interested in justice?
Oh, thank you for that question. All right. Well, so I was born in the front room of my mother's house, my mother's and maternal grandmother's house, delivered by a midwife. And to let you know my economic status, I lived about a block from the colored hospital. So you might say my family didn't have enough money for me to be born in even the colored hospital, you see. But my little town had a hospital dedicated to serving people of African descent, and virtually everything else in the town was segregated by race, except Christmas, incidentally. And I learned as I studied economics later in my life that Christmas was too important to the economy of the town to be exclusive. But racially segregated schools, racially segregated graveyards, of course, racially segregated houses of worship, and so forth. So how did I become interested in justice? I think being born in that context on the small end of things makes one naturally inclined toward a new way of living. So as a very young man, I was surrounded by elders who who encouraged us to think about a different way of living, a different kind of social organization, different kind of society. And that went on until about 1961, when things sort of exploded. We recognized that we were slightly more numerous than our oppressors in terms of the number of citizens. So we began to register to vote. And as a kid in the 10th grade, I was a part of something called the Sumter County Voters League, headed by a man who was a tailor by profession, and all of his clients were Black. So he was a bit immune from the kind of economic pressure that most Black people in the town had to contend with. And that produced a backlash that we frankly did not expect. And then we realized how pertinent what we were doing was to the whole system. That's a little bit of an introduction, but you can press me if you want to know more.
Yeah, that's a great segue into a second question I had, which was, your involvement in the civil rights movement, and something that we notice, I think, in the Black Lives Matter movement today is the emotions, right, that drive protests and the claims and the organizing. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your involvement in the civil rights movement, and then what kind of emotions guided your involvement.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand what you mean by, I know what the word emotions mean, but I don't know how you're applying.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, James Baldwin, who wrote about, rage and pessimism driving his dedication to this struggle.
Well, let me say again, as I intimated first, there were all kinds of things that could make you a little upset about things, shall we say. That's a good emotional word, right? My town, if you were lost, if you were driving through and you were a visitor and you got lost, you could tell that you were in the Black side of town because all the roads would be dirt roads. Black people lived on roads that were not paved. They had no sewage for runoff from water, from rain. And because we were in a part of Georgia known for red dirt, when it rained, all the streets were muddy and slippery. So I lived on a hilly street. So when it rained, we sat on the front porch and were entertained by watching people trying to retrieve their vehicles from ditches. And so in terms of motivation to challenge Jim Crow segregation, if you were just a little awake, you bought into resistance. The movement, once we identified a specific thing we wanted to tackle, a whole culture began to develop around what we know as the civil rights movement. The music, the personalities, the broadened view of the world, even in terms of teenage courtships. I always say to the young men that I mentor now, if you were interested in a girlfriend and you were not in the movement, your chances were slim. So it became a popular movement with interesting personalities who came from other places, who introduced new ideas to us about what was possible in the world. Music was very much a part of that in terms of jazz. Remember, I was in a rhythm and blues and country music area, and of course, gospel music. spirituals. So we also had some introduction to some of the jazz giants. As a matter of fact, I would say we had about 6 or 7 young people from the North who brought us accounts of things in the North. They disabused us of this idea that New Jersey was the promised land. Isabel Wilkerson talks about that a bit. But, you know, we grew up thinking if we could just get out of Georgia and make it to the North, you know, life would be a crystal stair, to use Langston Hughes's words, you see, switch them around a bit. But so we learned that this was America, although this was a more pronounced expression of racial exclusion, that one would find this even in other parts of the country, which, by the way, helped many of my schoolmates decide to remain in the South. And they're still there because they understood, as it were, there was no escape.
100%. Yeah. It's, you know, I think it's really important actually to speak about how the movement fits into, you know, a larger culture and things that are happening as you're growing up. It gives us a sense of, you know, how things are similar and different to a lot of the emotions that people are feeling, you know, growing up and seeing, you know, racist incidents again and again, and you know, that context, but not remaining in that context, because you also give us a lot of the joy, right? The joy of life, and that it's not as if, you know, it's only about grievance. It's about life. And maybe that's a segue to my next question, which is, you know, in sociology, we're always interested in analyzing positionality, right? How one's social position shapes their social life, right? In ways that are small and big. And, you know, for all that you've done and you continue to do, you know, how much does how you grew up and where and when you grew up shape who you became and who you are today?
Well, let me say Americus was very much an agricultural, the county seat of an agricultural county. It's the county seat of Sumter County, which includes Plains, Georgia, of course, the home of Jimmy Carter. And Americus, the town, was a place where farm products could be placed on the market. A lot of processing, you know, pecans, peanuts, and so on. And so one of the things that the civil rights movement did for us in casting a broader vision is it made many of my schoolmates think about going on to higher education. Not to say that we weren't interested, or a few of us were interested, but a much larger group. I think there were 63 students in my high school senior class, and around 45 of us are college graduates. And I think we saw education as some kind of window into a different kind of future. And I think we began to understand some things about what we might contribute to society as a result of that. And we were motivated. We had a sense of mission. We still have the same mission. You know, if, you know, as a pastor, I had many young people come to me and say, Dr. Howard, how did you get here? I remember a student at the seminary once coming to ask me, how did you get here? And the seminary at that time was located just in the block from Fifth Avenue on 29th Street, right behind the Marble Collegiate Church. It's up at 475 Riverside Drive now, but back in those days, the student came in and he said, how did you get here? I said, I walked over from Penn Station because I was living in Jersey. Well, that's not exactly what he was asking, you know. And he was quite disappointed to know that I never charted out that one day I would be a seminary president. I told him I'd never aspired to a position. I'd simply followed a mission. So New York Theological Seminary, for those who don't know, is a seminary devoted entirely to training church workers to live and work in the most challenging city or urban neighborhoods of our region. It is a regional seminary. And in the core curriculum is a course called Community Analysis and another course called Community Organization. So if you go back to 1961 or earlier for that matter, you'll see a pretty consistent kind of trajectory of my life, as would be true of many of my contemporaries. What they're doing today in law or other fields, education and so on, is driven by those early days of growing up in a racially segregated situation where there were many poor white people. And one of the points of confusion that we had there and took us off in terms of ideological critique, economic critique, and so on, is why were those white people content to be without so many material things, yet to refer to us by the N-word, when very often Black people had the basic necessities of life. I can say that I never went to bed hungry, whatever that image is about people growing up in the Jim Crow South. We had lots of good food to eat. We weren't wealthy, but I knew many whites who certainly must have gone to bed hungry. So these are things that shape our mission in life, and you know, it's really a sense of anchoring to know, as we say in the church, what you've been called to do.
A vocation, right? And I think it's really informative to hear you talk about having a mission come out of a specific place in time and really drive you through your trajectory, right? I know that a lot of younger people are feeling emotions and gaining a kind of moral perspective on the world from all of the changes that are happening now, and maybe it's more reassuring to know that it'll be something that drives them towards justice in their own lives outside of this moment. But I'd like to turn a little bit to some of the central themes for tonight, right? Racial injustice, how it connects to a crisis of democracy. And then we'll move back to look at, some historical, perspectives that you might offer, a little bit about New Jersey in particular, and then a look at, reparations and those kind of ideas. So while our national motto is E pluribus unum, right, out of many one, we're living a very bitter divisiveness right now, right? And part of that is a secondhand citizenship for many, many Americans. As, clamoring for change reaches a true cacophony, many turn a deaf ear, right? Others move to silence the means of social change, such as we saw in, there's so many examples, but in the recent executive order to ban racial sensitivity training, or our president calling Black Lives Matter discriminatory and, quote, bad for Black people. You know, Princeton scholar Eddie Glaude Jr. wrote, "The idea of America is in deep trouble," right? So where do you see where we are in America today? You know, what is this idea?
Well, you mentioned Glaude. He has a quote by Baldwin that says, "Look, America is always changing, but it never changes." And we had an old saying, you may know the saying, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And all of us are fond of saying, but of course, Bill Howard, there have been many changes. Of course, there have been many changes. But as we can see, many of them are fundamentally cosmetic. And the United States, my home, has done a brilliant job of marketing itself. But there is, as Eddie discusses in the book, a lie that we tell ourselves that we must overcome. We have, need I say, I mean, I'm embarrassed to rehearse this, any number of magnificent human achievements have been made on this soil. Technological achievements, don't let me begin. But we lie to ourselves fundamentally, and I think one source of mission, maybe it's not a good one, but I'll say that young white people who are intelligent and free and eager to know the truth is that they should be angry, at least initially, at so much that they have been, I would say, not allowed to know. Now, you might say they have the freedom to explore and so forth, but we're all on tracks, you know, and if the tracks don't lead us in a certain direction, I mean, there's a reason why I know a lot about Baldwin and the average white person doesn't. You know, some white people do, but I'm saying there's a reason why. And there's a reason why I know a lot more about European writers, you know, philosophers, historians, you know, and so forth, because I'm forced to live, as Du Bois would say, with a double consciousness. You see, if you wanted to know in my town what white people were really up to, you'd ask the maids, because they cleaned the toilets, they made up the beds, they heard the family arguments, which were often unbridled because the people arguing didn't think the maids were intelligent enough to know what was going on. You see? So anger that you've been on tracks. Look, I remember once having lunch with a young woman going back, 40 years ago, in a very swanky restaurant. She was my host, and we worked together with Norman Lear in founding something called People for the American Way, which still exists. And so we were on a committee, and we were meeting for lunch, and we were talking, and I kept referring to Langston Hughes. Now, this woman was a graduate of one of our most prestigious colleges and from a very wealthy family. And I kept saying things about Langston Hughes. Somehow what we were discussing made Langston relevant. And I mentioned him 3 or 4 times, and she said, "Bill, hold up. You keep mentioning this guy, Langston Hughes. Is that someone I should know? No, I don't think that's an exaggeration. And I think this is part of our problem. Am I going off the subject?
No, I mean you're moving us to sort of someplace I wanted to head towards the end of the talk, I think, which is segregation and its effects on political possibilities. But let's take maybe a step to look at really the largest protests ever in American history, right? This summer, the protests of Black Lives Matter following the.
You say it is, huh? Okay.
Following.
I don't see any of this as new, my friend, and I don't see even the involvement of white youth as some sort of new thing.
Mm-hmm.
You see, you may count numbers. Maybe the numbers are different, but in our fight against Jim Crow in America's Georgia, there were a noteworthy number of white youth, not local white youth, but white youth who left their homes and came down to the rural South. Now, you can exaggerate that. It wasn't like thousands, but you should check out the sedition case. You can easily find this. Americus, Georgia, 1963, I'm going to say, when 3 or 4 SNCC workers were charged with sedition, punishable by death in the state of Georgia. I believe one was black and 2 or 3 were white. Okay? By the way, the black student was an alumnus of Rutgers University, Donald Harris. But you look at the other young people, they were not black. Many young people today, they come and they say, Dr. Howard, is there anything new about what's going on? I said, yes and no. We have media. The media is much more pervasive now than it was in those days. But the transracial aspect of this is not new. And I'm not so sure how this summer would compare, for example, with Vietnam. We've had some pretty massive outpourings of outrage in our country, but we are really good at moving on and forgetting. And so what you see, the big question for us now, Stephen, is this. Will what we are going through now with a president who, in my opinion, and it's not a simple partisan view, but in my opinion, is attempting to overthrow the government. We have been given an opportunity now to shed the lie, to break free of what happened after Reconstruction. What happened after 1966, 67, 68? When America has been brought right to the threshold of a new future, and it caved in. It lost its courage. It happened in Reconstruction. If you should read Charles Blow's column of a few days back in the New York Times about the candidacy of the gentleman who's running for the U.S. Senate in Mississippi, who used to be a member of the House, and I should know his name, but I don't, African American. And he's writing about this guy's candidacy but he talks about Mississippi at the time of Reconstruction and what happened in Mississippi. And incidentally, what happened in Mississippi can explain why Mississippi is last in almost everything good today. And it's almost like an allegory for America. We have all sorts of potential for greatness, but the boogeyman of the doctrine of white supremacy is containing us. For example, I think we would be much more egalitarian from an economic point of view if race were not staring us in the face. Black people believe that we don't have a real robust embrace of universal health care because too many people in the country believe Black and brown people would be inordinate beneficiaries. Now, you may think that's paranoid thinking or whatever. I'm just giving you the story as it is. Race is, the sand in our shoe. It's our ingrown toenail, it's our migraine headache. And we go on dancing past it. I mean, reparations, for example. When Black people want reparations, folk respond to it like we created the idea. You see, but reparations is not, it's not original with us.
So you mentioned the lie, right, a little bit ago, and you're describing different aspects of the lie. I thought it would be helpful maybe to hear how Eddie Glaude Jr. put it, right? He called it the willingness of so many of our fellows to toss aside any semblance of commitment to democracy. And he's really referring to multiracial democracy, right? There.
Yes.
To embrace cruel and hateful policies exposes the idea of America as an outright lie, right? And I'm sure many, I hear this a lot in my courses, students who want to give up watching the news and they want to give up, thinking about these questions because it's so difficult to bear, right? I think Glaude Jr. also wrote, it's exhausting to find yourself, right? Over and over again, navigating a world rife with deadly assumptions about you and those who look like you, to see and read about insult and harm, death and anguish, for no other reason than because you're Black, or Black and poor, or Black and trans, or he said, I cannot escape the news. I am drowning in it. So what do you say to young people who are exhausted of having their identities called upon day in and day out by political rhetoric and by reports of police violence?
Let's see if I could go at it this way, and you bring me back to the question if I fail. In Eddie's prior book, the name of which I don't actually recall, you may know, but he says it's about value. It's about value. The lie is that a white life is more valuable than a Black life. I have the occasion to talk with whites about Black Lives Matter, Bill, of course, all lives matter. You know that expression. The founders of Black Lives Matter would be the first to say all lives matter. But this is the season when we have to say, because it appears evident that not everybody is convinced, that Black lives matter too, which is what that sign is saying. Mm-hmm. Black lives matter too. And Eddie says the lie is that somewhere below our heads, we don't believe that. The theory, look, social media, if you're into social media and you have a big African-American circle, which I do, if I said today, what is really America's basic problem? Everybody says race. Now, I don't happen to think that's true because I've been to Nigeria. I've been to a lot of places in the world, and I know there's a lot of human ignorance and fear floating around everywhere you go. But race is a peculiarly American, the way look, you talked about the World Council of Churches. Actually, I was part of something called the Program to Combat Racism in the World Council of Churches. And we've looked at the way Koreans are treated in Japan, the way the Maoris are treated in New Zealand, the way the Algerians are treated in France. You see, so we know this is a global issue, but American racism, chattel slavery, the lie that Black life is cheaper is the problem down there in our gizzard that we have to exercise. And there is a presumption that there is fear among some in the broader majority white community that Black people have a vendetta to settle. This is not a part of the psychology of Black America. To tell you an interesting little tale, I'm a pastor, so I tell stories. When I was a kid, a woman had worked for a wealthy white family for quite some time. She passed away, and she had a big funeral. And the church leaders heard that the people for whom she worked were coming to the funeral. So they reserved the front pew for that family. And I sat and watched those people, thinking that we put them on the front row because we thought they were so much better than we. But in fact, we put them there because we wanted to give them a special place in the homegoing service of their employee. And the vendetta part is something we have to address as we look at the demographics emerging in this country. 25 years from now, a generation, there will be no majority race. But that's not going to happen in 45, according to Brookins, 45. It's happening now. I see Dr. Stamato's on this Zoom. I think it's fair to say Rutgers has no majority now. But there's nothing to fear. And I said on another Zoom with my good friend Janine LaRue that the only thing white people have to fear is Aretha Franklin and fried chicken. You see? Now, maybe people on this call, by virtue of their predetermined interest in this subject, would consider this ridiculous. But believe me, it's palpable out there. It produces a fear that's primordial. And I don't know if you know the work of Frances Welsing, psychiatrist, Howard University. She passed away some time ago. But she had theories around melanin. And she said that the great white fear is that when there is transracial marriage and the production of kids, a little whiteness fades away. And she attached some psychological significance to that. Now, I'm not promoting the idea. I'm just saying a psychiatrist who knows more about these things than I, has written extensively. Now, tell me your question. I'd never answered it, right? Come on.
Well, we might as well push on a little bit. I was going to mention a recent book that's been well received by Professor Richard Alba called The Demographic Illusion, where he looks specifically at the children of mixed race unions, and most of the story is a pretty positive story. That, for example, the children of white and Latino unions end up moving into the mainstream, almost as much as white children of white parents. But there's a sort of sad exception, which is that for the children of one white parent and one African-American parent, that their children are more likely to follow the sort of social obstacles, to meet the social obstacles that their African-American parent had, right? And so maybe I think this question of how America is increasing diversity, they're increasing ethno-racial diversity, what it actually matters, how it matters for the lives of African Americans, and is a major empirical question, right? That we'll be really answering for the rest, I think, of the century, right? And if we look at the more recent Black Lives Matter protests, we saw a very ethno-racially diverse set of young people out there together. I think on our own campus, there's a lot of solidarity across racial lines. Those kind of things are really impressive, and students usually cite them as some of the best parts of their experience at Montclair State. But I can't help but have this sort of nagging doubt in my head, that lines up with something you said at a recent event that you had with former Governor Kane at NJPAC, where you said, we make just enough of an adaptation, right? Appeasing sort of the claims of a movement for equality and equity. We make just enough of an adaptation, for example, to protest and resistance, to appease the opponents of racial discrimination, but never to take the bull by the horns. So how do you see us overcoming that? How can young people who have these, transracial solidarities, or the increasing number of young people who have mixed race identities, what role do they play in making good, I think, on the claims for equity and equality?
Well, I'm very encouraged. Let me just say that. I'm not one of these people who believe that we can just relax and the young people are going to magically be different. Because I see incidents of young people. Need we cite the case of Kenosha or other places right in Huntington County the other day? I read about a young man who had done something very reprehensibly racist, white kid. But you have to applaud the young folk who are getting out there, taking risks, sometimes not understanding fully what the implications of what they're doing are. Sometimes they do. But I also think that sometimes white kids have the convenience of naivete, and very often they become radicalized or educated when they step out of their comfort zone and see that the system will be just as harsh, if not more so, toward them when they take a stand. And that's a part of the education. I mean, the land is littered with young people of all races who lost their lives or who lost opportunities because they took a stand And if they lived, they're senior citizens, but they still have that radical outlook of what they learned, 40, 50 years ago.
Hmm.
But the question really is, what is the motivation for a person who's living a kind of secure and relatively ordinary life where they can presume that the cops will find them drunk sitting on the curb and drive them home? What is their motivation to undertake what John calls good trouble? John Lewis, that is. What is the motivation? I mean, I can tell you my motivation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what made Ralph Allen from Trinity College of Hartford, Connecticut, come all the way down to Americus, Georgia, to get beat up by white police officers.
Mm-hmm.
Ralph Allen had it pretty good. What motivated him to step out of, obviously he's a white guy, right? What made the founder of the Koinonia Farm, a Greek scholar, professor at Emory University, what made him go and start a non-racial farm in Sumter County, Georgia, in the heyday of Jim Crow, in the 1950s, where blacks and whites lived together? You see? If we, and by the way, it was shot at. I remember my first experience of American terrorism at 8 years old, lying in the bed and feeling the house shake. And of course, we were all wondering, what on earth was that? And when the morning came, we learned that the feed store about 1.5 miles from my house, which sold feed to the Koinonia Farm for the animals, was bombed by the Ku Klux Klan. What motivated Clarence Jordan to build that farm? And incidentally, what made him stipulate in his will that when he died, he would just be buried in the field without a headstone? You see, it's some kind of, you can go Anne Brayton of Louisville, Kentucky. Read up on Anne. White Southerners who dared to resist Jim Crow, who often had to flee their homes. And I think young people are finding some kind of motivation despite their relative privilege, or some of them are not very privileged and are becoming aware that whiteness does not give them the privilege or options that they seek. And is that sustainable? I think the country, as I say, is very brilliant at marketing itself. And as you quoted me there, what I said was the industry, not just government, industry, higher education, all of the institutions of society, they're not sitting in a room planning this, but in their minds they're saying, what can we do to quiet these people down? Mm-hmm. You see, what can we do to bring things back to normal? Martha Friend, what can we do to bring them back to normal? You see, what is back to normal? You see, it's that step just shy of breaking free of the lie.
And I think that observation is something that people are really questioning right now, right? Given the significant decrease in just 3 months right, from June to September of support for Black Lives Matter, not amongst African Americans, but amongst white Americans and to a lesser extent amongst Latinos and Asian Americans, right? Whereas before it was a majority of every ethno-racial group supported Black Lives Matter. Now only 45% of whites do. And of course, there's a very large partisan divide as well, right? Where Republicans are much less likely to support it. I thought maybe you could speak about the threshold of promise, right? That the protests in the summer, make real. They realize certain socio-political possibilities. And are they waning away? How much, is there more that protest can accomplish than this? Or is this a fundamental limitation of protest in, majority rule democratic politics?
I don't think it's going away. It may be going underground. And, Langston here, a dream deferred. The image of a lanced boil, you see. America loses steps every time it has to come back and deal with what is an accumulating reserve of disgruntlement in the absence of justice. Mm-hmm. Just think of it. If every generation we didn't have to come to this, let's think of what it would mean if we weren't on the brink of destroying the democratic experiment based on the illusion that brown people are invading the country from the South. Think of that. We are about to pitch the American experiment overboard, which in my humble opinion is profoundly worth saving. But we don't want to pursue the course toward a more perfect union because it might include some people who are less valuable. We're shooting ourselves in the foot, or as my grandmother would say, and your grandmother may have said, cutting off our noses to spite our faces. When Obama was running for president, and incidentally, Barack Obama is a great illustration of something. I mean, aside from the fact that America voted for this guy twice, he was a great example of something. He was the best Negro we could give you. Ivy League educated, married to an Ivy League educated woman, beautiful daughters, no known scandals. He's the best we could give you, right? And he was a moderate. Mm-hmm. This is why Cornell is always beaten up on him. People get mad at Cornel West for criticizing the black president. I get mad at him too, and I tell him. But Cornell has a vision of a society that is much more just, much more distributive, where we are, in fact, approaching what Martin used to call the beloved community. It doesn't have to be socialism, but you see, to throw that out, most Americans, not all Americans, Americans go running. You say the word socialism. Oh, Bernie Sanders, and people equate Russia with Soviet Union when it's nothing but a gang, and we are working on one right here. When in fact, we need to have a dialogue in the country about what belongs in the private sector, Linda, and what belongs in the public sector. I'm not sure I want private business to run the highways. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's an easy one. We need to have this dialogue. And I don't want to snuff out individual initiative and private economy. I've been in countries where that has been done pretty successfully. And I don't intend to be moving there anytime soon. But if we don't come to terms with the rank inequity and systemic economic injustice in the society, Martin said it, either we live together as brothers and sisters, or we are going to perish as fools.
And given the sort of divisiveness of the current moment, though, right, it doesn't give you a lot of hope responding to that quotation. And if, maybe to end on this question, at least my questions, if we're trying to respond to these very entrenched racial inequalities, racial injustices, and the country is very divided, you have stories being told about who America is that do not resonate with the facts of our founding as a multiracial country, right? And in proposing something like a third Reconstruction,
our founding as a multiracial country, is that what you said? No, sir. No,
yeah,
sir.
that no. I would argue that
we were multiracial, but we were not founded as a multiracial country.
Okay, correction taken.
My point. Let's argue that out a little bit. You see, Black people were not in the Constitution. Women were not in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
See, all of this is emerging. And by the way, it's a beautiful thing. But the founders didn't anticipate this. Now, the framework they built can accommodate this, but they weren't thinking about this. We get into this discussion about Brother Woodrow, who was, the racist dude. And then they say, well, George Washington owned slaves. Yes, we can't go back and correct all of that. We can't, but we need to acknowledge it, you see, and begin to embrace the creeping multiracialism that has been coming, but just before it can blossom into a beautiful bouquet, we chop it off at the knees.
Mm-hmm.
Read the Blow column on Mississippi, Hiram rebels going to the U.S. Senate and so forth, and then come right up to the March on Washington in 1963, a very broad interracial coalition. Maybe more Black people, but a lot of white people were in Washington in 63. Or even the coalition that elected Obama. See, this was sort of a residual hangover of the King ideology or vision. But the dilemma is typified in two sisters. I remember some of you may have seen this on network television. There were two older women, sisters, living together and apparently very close, they were very close sisters. One was a big Obama supporter and one was not. And they interviewed them. They went to the house and the woman who was against Obama, she said, they asked her, well, your sister, she's so enthusiastic and you seem to really love and respect your sister. She's a big Obama person, but you're not. It's okay that you're not, but tell us why. And she said something, and obviously I'm not quoting her exactly, but she said, well, he seems like a nice guy, nice family, well-educated, handsome, so forth. But don't you know what they're going to do to us when they get in the White House? You see? That shocked me.
Yeah, the race to buy guns, for example.
Oh, they're going to rise up and they're going to make us pay for all those years of slavery and sharecropping and Jim Crow and de facto segregation. And the average Black person would hear that and laugh. is not a part of the discourse. And, this notion of Black lives not mattering is something I can't, because I'm not in that box, I can't tell you how to get out of it. But that's the salvific prospect of America.
So the Movement for Black Lives, this coordinating organization that helps to coordinate the platform across Black Lives Matter chapters, has developed a set of recommendations for responding to racial injustice. That's very complex and nuanced. It looks at different levels of government. It looks at different actors, government and community actors. And if one was to sort of sum it up, it would be really about reparations, right? It would be something about this third Reconstruction. And so, given the way you've spoken about racial backlash, this historical cycle of progress being met with backlash, how can we move towards community-based reparations while mitigating that backlash?
Oh, I think the backlash, the fear, we'll call it fear, the ignorance. That's a big one. I don't want to try and offer any simple answer, but and incidentally, the work that these younger people are doing, while I may not be familiar with the details, I am a big admirer. I think they represent something very pregnant for the society. And you have to ask, why are they still hopeful enough to offer a plan, to offer a proposal? This place is so ripe for cynicism, And I would say, look at H.R. 40. Mm-hmm. H.R. 40. I am an H.R. 40 advocate because I think if we were all in accord and decide, yes, reparations, let's do it. I think it's a much more complex thing to implement.
Let me interrupt and just explain. H.R. 40 is a 2019 call to study, examine what injustices have been done as a result of slavery and how they continue to this day. Right? Is that an accurate description of it, Reverend Howard?
And to contemplate the methodology of implementing something we call reparations, because there are 1,000 ideas about how reparations, if it were granted, how it would be granted, right? So, for example, in Black Not Dutch, I talk about the challenge. The Black Manifesto is a challenge to churches and synagogues only, not to the broader society, not to government, but to religious groups. And it specifies how funds, if given, would be used, right? And it does not propose that each individual who could actually trace their beginning to Africans living in the United States should get a check. But it had much more to do with transformation of institutions and investing in institutions. But I think that it would be very important for a congressional committee to appoint non-elected experts in sociology, in economy, in anthropology. I mean, all of these cross-disciplinary fields who will not bring us a political set of recommendations. But we are also a country, to quote Baldwin again, who's always changing, but nothing very much changes. And we have had some sweet studies. The Kerner Commission, my Lord, if we just go back and read that and work on that. And how old is that? So I'm not interested in one more study, but ideally, if legislative initiatives can be garnered around a vision that such a wise group of informed people, and we have some of the smartest people in the world, in the country, to come up with a plan for a reparations that would have the greatest impact. That's what we're all interested in. And you got to think about this. We are still living, in other words, there have been adjustments along the way, and people like Bill Howard have snuck under the door and made it into some place that, white poor people would consider admirable, right? But the masses of people of African descent still languish in the rural areas of the country. Very often they are landless. And Lord knows cities like mine, Newark, a great deal of what you see in terms of family dysfunction, the collapse of education, the lack of economic wherewithal. This is all a residual of American slavery. And individual white people need to be freed of the notion that when we say this, we are not blaming individual white people, but all of us have responsibility. You hear white people say, well, I wasn't in slavery. I wasn't back there then. My people didn't have any money back then. Well, it's a wrong-headed attitude. And if I explain it to you and you still come up with that, I know you're not interested in a constructive answer. Mm-hmm. You see? But I do think the country has yet, Bill Clinton did it, and one of a few other individuals, the country has not said, we were a slave-holding state. We started out in a way that breaks our hearts, that embarrasses us, and we want to make this right. See, some kind of a real statement like that. And I don't mean with our mouths, right? That's what's holding us up. Cornell says we are constipated. You see, we know we have to go, and we go in a little room and we sit down and it just won't come out.
Yeah, there's a lack of truth.
Let me use that analogy.
There's a lack of truth telling, right?
Yeah, and it's so liberating. I think what I found, people, I'm going to speak now in black and white, and it's not that simple, believe me. But when I visited the home of Ann Braden in Louisville many moons ago, I met a white female Episcopalian full of joy. She did not have one bit of guilt on her shoulder. She was a fighter. She was a genuine patriot in America, although she was ridiculed by people who looked like her in Louisville, okay? But she was free. Miles Horton, these people, once they shook the lie for themselves, were liberated. Mm-hmm. And so we're not inviting people to something that will kill their spirits. I think Baroque music is great. But if you don't know who Curtis Mayfield is, I'm going to pray for you.
You present ultimately like this very optimistic vision, right? Despite these heavy burdens and unresolved burdens of our, 1619 dated, chains. right, physically. And I thought maybe a fitting end is to have a quotation from James Baldwin, who wrote about America as, quote, a place at once so free, yet so bound, always present, but never found.
Wow. Wow.
And you're telling us to seek it, right? We can continue to seek it, to seek this freedom, this liberation for all in the United States, regardless of our ethno-racial identities.
Yeah, and the Tom Kane conversation, I think you've reviewed. We had this conversation where the governor was saying he was blessed in his early years to have intimate connections with Black people and so forth and so on. And that he learned a great deal by having those opportunities to be able to connect with folk, and presumably vice versa. And I think he's right about that. I would say opportunities for people not to get together around, cocktail parties. I don't mean that, but actually to work together on some common projects for people to discover common humanity. But those opportunities, I would suggest, are less available to us today. We are really more siloed today than we might have been another time ago. You can tell me that as a sociologist, but New Jersey is probably one of the most segregated states in the so-called northern area, and it was the last state to abolish slavery. Hello?
Is that right? I
guess
didn't know that. Yeah.
don't know that. It was the last northern state to abolish slavery. And if you take the Black people out of Newark, Camden, Trenton, Jersey City, Paterson, you might name Asbury Park, maybe, you wouldn't have any Black people in New Jersey, practically.
Yeah, and in fact, I was going to say the statistics. While nationwide, the most common indicator of segregation is the index of dissimilarity, and while nationwide it's gone down, in I would say showing impressive progress over the last 3 decades. In the two major metropolitan areas of New Jersey, it's like a trickle. It's hardly changed, right? And given that segregation, it's especially important for I think white people to think about how they can show up for racial justice. And I wanted to share a list of possibilities, 10 things you can do for racial justice from the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, which I just shared in the chat box. But I thought maybe it's a good time. I've been asking too many questions to take maybe 10 minutes and hear some questions from other people who are still tuned in to.
Stephen, thank you for that plug for the Institute. But let me urge people to, if they haven't yet, read Bob Kervin's book, Inside Newark. It's an excellent book to have in your collection there about the urban scene.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I threw it up there in the chat box so people can make reference to it. Great. So maybe you've been talking a lot. You can grab a sip of water and give people a chance to speak or to write their questions into the chat. We covered a certain amount of ground, but there's a lot of topics we didn't really touch on that could be of interest, right? We have some questions coming in the chat box. And maybe while the questions are coming in, I'll take a second to correct sort of how I mentioned the multiracial country that at the founding. And I think that we can say that we were surely not a multiracial polity, right? That's like the technical term for the political system. But we were a multiracial society, right? We had people from different racial groups who have been captured by the census since our our formal founding as a country. And so it's, the fact that the power structure was so exclusive to white males, throughout our history, is of course what you were responding to, right?
Yes. Agreed.
So
and it's changing. Look, I went to Americas in 2016. No, was it? No, I was in Americas in 2013, and I stayed in the Windsor Hotel downtown. And the Windsor Hotel was a whites-only hotel, and rather foreboding white men sat on the front porch and chewed tobacco in rocking chairs when I was a kid. But now I'm in the hotel and I'm staying in the Jimmy Carter suite, right? So I go down to the front desk on a Sunday afternoon. My appointment is on Monday. And I said to the young college student who was manning the desk, I said, is there some place that I can have a nice meal? Because the restaurant and the hotel was closed. I said, I don't want fast food. Is there a nice restaurant? He said, oh, yes. You walk about a block and a half down this way, and the name of the restaurant is 1800. Okay, so not knowing what to expect, I walked down to the restaurant, and it was a restaurant that could have been in Mexico City, except it was in Americus, Georgia, the finest Mexican restaurant. And I've had Mexican food in Phoenix and in Mexico City. I know what to expect. Mm-hmm. There I was in Americus. And the next morning when I got up, I went, headed out of town to Southwest Georgia, in Albany, Georgia, and I stopped at a gas station, and a man from India came out to fill up my tank. It's coming. And, it was here in the beginning, but it is fleshing itself out, and people are expecting to be included in the polity.
Mm-hmm. And it's the most popular foods in America, pizza and tacos, are of course immigrant foods, and it's always a nice sign of inclusion. Whether it symbolizes a real depth of integration is an empirical question. But let me ask some of the questions that are coming from the audience. Quentin Robertson writes, Dr. Howard, where do we go from here no matter who wins the U.S. presidency?
Well, if this ends early enough, I'm going to hear Biden talk to, what's his name on NBC? That was meant to be humorous.
I didn't.
Quentin, there you are. Well, I don't know. I think, I'm going to just say to you, I am going to vote for Biden and Harris. And neither one of them would have been my first choice. Okay? But I'm voting for them. And I don't expect America to be the beloved community on November 4th. But I do believe these two people will give me and those who travel with me more wiggle room to keep pressing for a more inclusive and just society. I think we are on the verge of some brand of fascism. And I don't think I'm overstating this as I look, and I can cite to you why I say this, the obliteration of government agencies and so forth and so on. So I think we'll know in November whether we have to risk our lives in some kind of bold resistance to what is going on at that time, or whether we have a way to civilly prosecute a broadening of our coalitions, the meeting of the minds, listening, sharing. That's the best that I can tell you. But I do believe that if we get to the end of the road, and by the way, there is no bench by the side of the road called freedom. I'm an eternal vigilance guy. You fight for freedom, you protect freedom, okay? But if we don't find a way for people to have meaningful lives according to their interest and ability, without undue obstacles, we are going to come right back to this point ever so often. And it can become more and more disruptive and violent with each new stage. We have too many people of color in prisons. When I was president of New York Seminary, the seminary operated and still does a degree program inside Sing Sing prison. You go inside that prison, you could walk practically a whole day without seeing a man who was not Black or Puerto Rican. No. Unless you believe these people are genetically criminal, you have to ask a different kind of question. So, Quentin, I'm thinking wherever we are going, we're going to have to answer those questions and find solutions to those problems. And to find, look, we are being held hostage by the police departments that we pay. Do I believe there are really excellent, fine people, men and women, who are police officers? Absolutely, yes. But where are they when we need them to step up to the plate and finger the so-called rotten apples? Look at what is happening in Louisville today. Look at what, and you have a Black agent to prosecute this nonsense. We have got to wake up and understand that you cannot murder people on the streets like this without it endangering all of us. And Niemöller comes in here. If you don't speak up for George Floyd, there won't be anybody around to speak up for you. And I believe that is our situation. Quentin, I'm sorry I gave you a long answer.
It to sort of connect it with something you said earlier, it makes me think that, you know, we're at sort of a breaking point here where there's a sort of Civil War feeling that's palpable, right? Yes. This divisiveness. And, you know, if the president is reelected, it feels like, or maybe he's not reelected, and in the time before inauguration happens, there's outbreaks, that the reconstruction is then the phase that would follow, right? That is still to come. But it feels like maybe a reconstruction can begin if the Democratic candidates are elected, right? And civil society can play the role that is played in pushing them towards those racial claims. But I have a very practical question from Margaret Dukes, who asked, should we vote for or against New Jersey Public Question 3? And I thought I would read it to people who don't know what that is off the top of their heads. A yes vote supports this constitutional amendment to postpone the redistricting process until after the election of 2021, or keep in place the current legislative districts until 2023. And a no vote opposes this constitutional amendment, from where legislative district maps would be certified immediately in 2020. Do you have any position on that, Reverend Howard?
Well, listen, in general, and there are people on this Zoom who may have much more expertise, but my opinion is that we need to depoliticize, to the extent that we can, the question of redistricting, or as we call it, gerrymandering. We see that as a reality all over the country. You got to understand, when I grew up in Georgia, there was no Republican Party. And the fact that we don't have a real, reasonable, policy-oriented party fighting with Democrats now makes me nervous, because Democrats running loose with no competition and no rational counter-argument scares the hell out of me, okay? I just think we need not to, it's like the Supreme Court. I think if the Supreme Court winds up the way it appears to be going, it's a tragedy. And people say, well, the Democrats can expand the court. Of course they can. And then later on, the Republicans will expand the court. You see, I think redistricting is like that. Now, if we wait until after the election, you might argue on principle, we're so close to a new dispensation in government, whichever way it goes, it could be. But I would much rather see, and maybe it is this way, and I don't know it because I'm not so versed on who sits on these committees, but anything that is totally left to elected officials now, it bothers me. You know, they may have ultimately a vote, but if you take the Death Penalty Study Commission, which was, I chaired this commission in New Jersey. We recommended to the state legislature an action, but on the committee, we had a very diverse group of people with expertise that brought what I thought to be a thoughtful product to the legislature, and they made the decision. So I guess I'm not sure what I think about that question, but those are my thoughts behind it.
Thank you for giving us some input into how to make those decisions. Dr. Samato, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yes, one point, Bill, and then a comment on your qualifications to be speaking with us tonight. I wanted to just reiterate and emphasize how important the theme was that was recurring through your remarks, which is how much the nation will benefit if we agree to the notion of reparations in whatever form it takes, when it's substantial and significant in all the ways it needs to be. You know, often we think about, say, offender prisoner relationships, and we think about the person who is forgiven is the one who gains more than the one who needs to give it. So there's this sense that white people will gain so much more if we extend to our Black brothers and sisters precisely the goodness of the nation that we ourselves have known, and that's going to be the liberation that you refer to. I think it's so important for us to keep that in mind when we talk about a lot of what we do. The other thing I wanted to say, though, at the outset, Stephen, you have a challenge when you try to introduce Bill, because there's so many things you can say about this great man. But one thing I would myself want to be sure everybody understood is that he was chairman of the Board of Governors of Rutgers during a period of time when most people would say, well, what does a Board of Governors do anyway? Don't they just sit up there and have dinner and drinks and so forth? But with the president, Dick McCormick at the time, Bill created a program that made it possible for young people in all the cities where Rutgers has a presence, Newark, Camden, Piscataway, New Brunswick, for students who achieved a certain level to go to Rutgers for free for 4 years. But we not only gave them that opportunity because of what Bill did, but we made it possible for them to be prepared so that when they were in elementary school, they began to get mentoring and support and tutoring. And I think it was Bill just 2 to 3 years ago when the first class graduated. It's an extraordinary thing because it's a capsule of opportunity that he made possible. So when most of us think about what can we do, there are these kinds of ideas that make it possible for people, individual people, to reap the benefits of good in the society and let us benefit from their talents. Thanks very much. Good to see you, Bill.
Thank you, Linda. And you know, this pandemic is really a strange gift to the society, because we've been fighting for generations over the question of health care for the people of the country. And here, to build on Linda's point about win-win, I think we can oversimplify it by calling it that. Do I want to be in a society with an epidemic running loose in the society, and the person in front of me in the grocery line has no way to get treatment? That's likely to expose me. And if we think of things in this manner, and what we lack is some kind of broad discourse. I think it's going on in local communities that we may not know. But that whole thing about a national conversation on race, I think that's an empty expression. But I do think we ought to be having some conversations that let us attend to the question of race. I look at the Midwesterners, for example. I used to be a sheet metal works factory worker in Illinois. And I think about all those skilled laborers who are now out of work. What globalization offered some sectors of our economy didn't offer other people, at least in their minds, similar options. So they've had their whole lives shut off by the reality of a rapidly changing economy. And both Democrats and Republicans have failed to address that fundamental problem. And I think the 2016 election was to some extent an expression of that frustration. So if we had this national discourse where we could talk about private sector responsibility, public sector responsibility, meaningful work for all people, guaranteed basic floor income, oh boy, these are the big challenges that a true bright light in the world will have to confront. And yet, as you point out, Stephen, we're so polarized. How do we even begin to discuss it? I commuted to New York for, 30 years. And almost every year they were debating who should fund Amtrak, That's a no-brainer. They're fighting over the Portals Bridge. I think maybe they've resolved that. I have a very good friend, Richard Roper, Linda, worked for the Port Authority. And when our governor trashed the extra tunnel going into Manhattan, I learned the Port Authority had been studying this for 20 years as a key to the continuing development of the economy of the region. But the polarization that we have makes it difficult for us to address. I'm going to be quiet now, and we have a few more minutes. Let's get everybody's question out, and I'll give very short answers, or other people can answer too.
Yeah, any of some of my students, I see they're still on, and what we read for today is so relevant to what you just said, which is we read from Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild, where she lays out the deep story, the sense of, betrayal that many of these white Tea Partiers have at the sense of President Obama being elected and affirmative action, that people are cutting in front of them in line. And that those stories that they tell amongst themselves create political, obstacles towards lots of problems, right? From obviously responding to racism and white supremacy, but also environmental problems, right? Any questions from students or other people who are in the audience tonight?
I have one.
Please.
Okay. Hello. I'm really fascinated with your perspective on all of this because I feel like every religious person I have ever encountered has had difficulty understanding and empathizing with the Black Lives Matter movement. I was raised by like a Catholic conservative, so I've had a lot of that influence in my life. So I guess I was just wondering, was it difficult for you, or has it ever been difficult for you to come to certain conclusions on your political beliefs or societal beliefs because of your religion?
Well, to talk about religion broadly can be very confusing. Do I say Chalet, Denison?
Shaley,
okay. It can be very confusing because there are camps within religions. And incidentally, let's say I'm a Christian. I find more debate within Christendom than I would have with a Muslim or with a Jew or with a Zoroastrian, So religion is a very, very wildly diverse concoction. But the most dominant expressions of religion tend to err on the side of opposition to social progress. Doctrine is always a trick in a continuing, evolving society. For example, I read an article the other day about the lifetime appointment to the federal court. And at the time, according to this writer, that was put into effect, the lifespan of a white male was 40. So the implications of a lifetime appointment is quite different when the lifespan is 79 or 80, you see? Religion tends to snap things in a certain period and think of it as having not eternal application, because there are always principles that can be brought forward, but the actual doctrine. You see, I had a sermon once in the church. Jesus never rode the subway. So when you think of, for example, keep in mind too that a lot of people are not guided by religion. They use religion as an excuse to support where they are going sociologically. On the question of gay marriage, and by the way, you can read my blog, you can see what I write about gay marriage. I'm a Baptist preacher in a black church where there's a lot of homophobia and bigotry in general, okay? But I explain to people, when I see two men kissing, it makes my flesh crawl. But that's because of how I was socialized. It has nothing to do with Jesus, you see. It's all about our socialization. And so when the First Methodist Church of Americus, Georgia, would not allow me to come in, even though I was a baptized Christian, you think they're operating on Christian principle? Or they're operating on some socially derived perspective? And religion was used as a cover. And you'll find that in Catholicism. And by the way, be careful now. Be careful. Catholicism has its good points, even conservative Catholicism, right? So don't throw the baby out with the bath, but do hold on to your faculties to critique and discern. You see? And be able to determine where you part ways. And I can say, poor me, I hold so many views that are contrary to church doctrine. I would qualify to be burned at the stake. But it's based on the reality that every mortal being is valuable and every one of us has to eat. You see? And one other sermon I preached, let's take abortion. That's a hot button issue, and you know it because you're from the Catholic Church. I posted on my social media the other day. If you abolish Roe v. Wade, you don't abolish abortion. You just abolish safe abortion. So what is your aim? That's very confusing, especially when you talk to a religious person who receives your comment and believe that you are respectful and religious. It's very confusing because the doctrine does not guide you at that point. You're on your own. You have to employ your own critical faculties. The point that Stephen made about the food and how it was all immigrant food. What food in this country is not immigrant food, except, on the Oglala Sioux reservation. I tell you, all of this is right in front of us. If we would just, I've had experience with Islam, and in my church, I had mothers who had sons who had converted to Islam. And they would come to me and say, "Pastor, why don't you talk some sense into his head? Can I bring him to speak with you?" And my answer would always be, "Yes, please, have him come." And when the person would come, we would talk about the Quran. We would talk about the diversity within Islam. We would think about some of the modern sociological realities in Western society that may bang up against Islam. And then the son would go out of the office and say to his mother, "Mom, I love this reverend. I think I want to come back to see him." Why? Because he's discussing the commonalities of life. And you must do that, in my opinion. I'm sorry.
Do we have other questions? Thank you for that answer. I also heard something interesting in your response about divisions between different organized parts of Christianity. And in your own experience, you've led many ecumenical organizations, right? Committees that have done important work. In those experiences, was there always a sense of division and tension, or is it, how did ecumenical organizations, which I've never worked within, how do they go about accomplishing broader goals?
Well, you asked two questions. I'm going to tell you, I've been going through my life, I've resisted the colonization of my mind. So anything you bring to me that has that objective is going to be pushed back a little bit. And the extent to which religion does that, I've been a pretty good combatant. I can give you a long list of benefits of religious faith as well. But the doctrinal dimensions that are plucked from an age long ago, which, by the way, I find, at least in my experience, that people are very good at picking the doctrines that suit their case. Oh, yeah. Oh, boy, they're good. Some of the most assertive and dynamic and brilliant women in our church will never read Paul's admonition to women to be silent in the church, right? And by the way, I agree with him because, Paul had no idea what was coming in the 21st century. That doesn't negate Paul. But when in the Bible, pardon me for talking about this particular text, but in the Bible, the known world did not even include America, didn't include so many other parts of the world. So you found the great prophets, particularly the Hebrew Bible, giving us a glimpse of the world they knew, you see. And I think in ecumenical organizations, that's why they get in trouble with the tribalist, is because they are brought together with people from radically different backgrounds, and they have to look for common understanding among them. So when they go back home to their tribes, they look like foreigners because they have come from this place of mutual understanding. This is what I found in the World Council of Churches. American church leaders would go off to Geneva and they would engage in these wonderful discussions and discover the humanity of the Kabanguish of Zaire or Congo, or the Black Dutch Reform of South Africa. I mean, all of these different types of people, and they would go back home with deep appreciation for them to a community that thought Jesus came to save America. You see? And this notion of America being a Christian nation. What I say, and Rodney Smith was on this call, he's heard my sermons too many times. If we don't fight for a civil society that does not show preference for religion, religious freedom is in deep trouble. Do I need to say that again? And see, I know this for being in Iran when the Shiites took over the government. And by the way, they didn't run the Christians out right away. They ran the Baha'is out because Baha'is emerged from Islam. You see? So we have to be careful with this issue of sanctifying a religion. Leave that to the religious people. So, I mean, I think I've answered your question. And more, maybe. Huh?
Definitely, and more. Took the words out of my mouth. Any other last closing questions? I was just going to ask to end what your plans for the week before the election and maybe the election day are. If you have any advice for us on how to process all of that.
One question was raised about the Kervin book, and that is Dr. Robert Kervin. Mm-hmm. That's the proper name, and the book is Inside Newark. Great book. Now, I intend to, of course, as a New Jersey resident, vote on the ballot that they will send me. I will take it to a, dedicated poll drop box. I believe there is funny business going on in the post office. I'm delighted that postal workers are putting up whatever resistance they can to it. But there are structural things like destruction of machines and this kind of thing. So I'm going to go to the poll. What do you call that thing?
The drop box, I think.
Drop box, yes. I'm going to, in fact, I went to my mailbox today. Some people have voted in New Jersey. Tomorrow, if I don't get my ballot, I'm calling my election superintendent, with whom I have a running email back and forth, by the way. And I think that our biggest problem in New Jersey, and other people have similar problems, but in New Jersey, I don't think voting is going to be an issue because I think the Trump suit will not be relevant. I think by the time it gets to be heard, we will have all voted. You know what I mean, right? The federal government has filed a suit against New Jersey's approach to mail ballots? Do we sort of know that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes? Okay. I think our problem is going to be, if we have a problem, is going to be in the vote count. And I've written to the Secretary of State in New Jersey to ask if the state is prepared to give support to counties that may be overrun by vigilantes. I don't know if you remember the hanging Chad issue. Most of you probably do. But in Florida, when they were counting, you had the Brooks Brothers boys. How many of you remember that? You know, not the Proud Boys or the Boogaloo Boys, but the Brooks Brothers boys banging on the door and intimidating the people inside who were counting the ballots. I think that will be, I'm not saying that will be a problem, but I think that is potentially the problem in New Jersey. Now, states like Pennsylvania and so forth, they have other problems that can turn ugly in a heartbeat. Because I don't know if you know, the legislature is considering voting in Pennsylvania to basically make some decision about how they want to treat the outcome of the election. Have you been following that? I don't know, but if that's because we don't really vote for the president, we vote for the electors, right? Oh boy, but that's my plan, and when they announce the winner, if it's Joe Biden, I'm going to be calling up all the organizers to keep on working. If it's Donald Trump, I don't know. I might have to go back and read Dietrich Bonhoeffer again. Brother Francis, I see you bowing your head over there. You know what I mean, right? So that's America at the crossroads right here. And I want to be careful not to be so overtly partisan. And I have convinced myself that I'm not being partisan in the ordinary sense, because I think we're voting this season to save the republic. And you help me if I'm exaggerating, but that's where I'm standing right now.
I think those are probably fitting words to end our conversation tonight, before Zoom kicks us all off in 1 minute. So I want to thank you, Reverend Howard, for sharing, your wisdom. It's not every conversation that I feel, a little smarter and with a lot more space for reflection after having it. And I really appreciate you taking your time tonight I think we have less than a month now before the election, to share your thoughts on so many important themes, from deep history to, social movements to international, action, and back down to the current moment in the election. So I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for being here with us and for, asking questions and being active. I really appreciate it. And we'll see what happens in a month.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I have a parting word?
Of course.
I've been greatly hosted by you, and it's been a pleasure to see so many people, many of whom I've never met before. But I had a high opinion of you after we had our preliminary chat. But my estimate of you actually went up a bit when the little one came and joined you.
I saw that.
I wasn't sure what to do, but I figured, hey, now I have experience with babies and shooting on Zoom, so.
Save your tuition money, my friend.
Exactly. We are. Well, thank you so much, and good night.
Good night. Good night, Bill. Good night, everybody.